When I was a child, very, very long ago, I had a dream that all men should work together, that all human beings should be bound in a common fellowship. That was the basis of my childhood education, that I learned at my father's knee and that I learned from my mother's lips. And that dream has haunted me all my life.
Sarojini Naidu was born in Hyderabad on the 13th of February 1879 to Aghornath Chattopadhyay and Baroda Sundari. From her very childhood, the events in her life flowed along the streams of unity and harmony. This led to her unique vision of a universal integration. This vision ultimately formed the philosophy of her life.
Please think of this. Being a Bengali Brahmin lady, she married into a different caste and in different region. She was born at Hyderabad, which was then in the native state ruled by Nizam, and it was the center of Indo-Muslim culture. And she was imbibed in this culture and brought up in that culture. She went to England and mastered the English language and started writing poetry in English language.
Among her later work, The Bird of Time and The Broken Wing have been universally lauded.
She passed the matriculation examination from Madras University at the age of 12, and a year later went to London on a stipend from the Nizam and spent 3 years at London University and in Girton College, Cambridge. In London, she met Edmund Goss, who was tremendously impressed with her mastery of the English language. But he advised her to write on Indian subjects and Indian themes, and that advice she followed all her life. This pride in the Indian heritage is obviously a major theme, and we also note a freedom from provincial narrowness and the freedom from religious narrowness. She wrote of nature, the Indian nature, the Indian landscape. She also wrote of folk customs. She wrote of the snake charmer, of the palki bearers, and other festivals and activities of the common people with great lyricism and song. There's her major theme, and she is celebratory. She never condemns, she never deplores, she never describes horror or terror. Her emphasis is on the positive, the beautiful, and the good.
The renowned political leader Gopal Krishna Gokhale suggested to Sarojini that she turn her powerful mind to the plight of the people. In 1914 came her historic meeting with Mahatma Gandhi. Inspired by him, she became an active participant in the fields of the Indian freedom movement and social reforms. In 1925, she became the first lady president of the Indian National Congress. After independence, Sarojini Naidu became the governor of Uttar Pradesh. In all her activities, Mahatma Gandhi was the fountainhead of her idealism and the guiding star of her life.
I have been asked to say something about Mahatma Gandhi. Of all the subjects in the world, the most difficult for me to speak about is Mahatma Gandhi. You might as well ask me to separate a bit of myself from my own being, you might as well ask me to separate the blood from my veins or the heartbeat from my heart. I do not mean it in any romantic sense, but I mean it very literally, in a very profound and intimate sense, because Mahatma Gandhi has been so closely and so deeply a part of my life as the lives of many thousands of men and women in India.
Professor Mukherjee, we all know Sarojini Naidu was a Nightingale of India. She sang in English. She was a great poet. She was a great orator. She was nevertheless a great politician. How do you look at her as a politician?
Well, Professor Rahman, you have asked me a question which requires a comprehensive answer. But at the same time, I'm sure that Srimati Sarojini Naidu was a truly integrated person, and in the capacity of a politician, a very picturesque politician also, a patriot, but with the most deep emotional involvement with the people of her country. And as a propagandist in the best sense of the term, she was a personality which is becoming almost a vanishing phenomenon in our present-day life. As everybody knows, she was a great orator, and you have said it. I have heard her many times. I had the privilege of sharing the platform with her many years ago in 1936 when she spoke on the situation, the civil war in Spain, and I was one of the speakers. She was a truly magnificent orator with a voice which perhaps gave some credence to the appellation of the Nightingale of India. And that was because of her poetry. Of course, one might have many views in regard to how a person not born to the English language can write truly significant English poetry. But I'm not going into that. There is no doubt about the excellence of her compositions, which were appreciated by many people. But that was only a small part of the personality of Sarojini Naidu. As she said, she was a patriot of the finest quality. I remember how in our young days, I used to recall what she said the great Gopal Krishna Gokhale had told her one evening in Pune on a rooftop. Gokhale is reported by herself to have said to her, "O poet, see visions from the hilltops and spread abroad the message of hope amid the toilers in the valleys." This kind of inspiration she reported to other people that she got from Gokhale. Now, her role in politics was a compound of the poet and the politician, which is why sometimes we found her in very equivocal positions also. Quite often she was bracketed along with the right-wing section, so to speak, of the Congress leadership, with Vallabhbhai Patel and Rajendra Prasad and Govind Vallabh Pant, especially at the time when Subhash Chandra Bose was very prominent in Congress leadership. But at the same time, she was not a right-winger at all. On the contrary, because she was a poet and a politician of a different sort, she could combine different entities, so to speak, in her performance. And so we found this person espousing some of the most radical ideas. She was, for some time, the president of an organization which we started called the Friends of the Soviet Union. And she would give voice to India's aspirations in the Asian Conference of 1950, for example, or even earlier in 1947, where she would be taken as a radical. But at other points of time, she would side with the comparatively conservative sections of the Congress leadership. She could do so because she belonged to a different kind of India from the India that we see today. And Professor Rahman, I suspect behind your mind is an idea that perhaps these days we are living and working in a fashion which is neither here nor there, neither in conformity with the fundamentals of the Indian tradition, nor consistently with the requirements of the present day. Now, Sarojini Naidu, whom I could see, for instance, in literary gatherings, as in the house of Sudhindranath Datta, who edited the Parichai, she would come and talk scintillatingly with a humor which is absolutely beyond anybody's capacity for imitation, and in a language which, whatever the occasion, was always of the finest quality, but always giving an impression of a person who looked upon life in a very different way from a politician would do. She was, I wouldn't say she was a philosopher, but basically aesthetics was part of her composition. And she came to the national movement because there was no other go for a really sensitive person except to jump into the stream of the national movement.
Professor Hiralal Chopra, a renowned Islamist, Persian scholar, freedom fighter, 84. It's a rare privilege for us to ask him about the great politician, poet, freedom fighter that Sarojini Naidu was. Professor Chopra, could you tell us when did you meet her first and how did you feel then?
Dr. Hussain, you have taken me back 70 years of my life, of course, when in the 20s of this century, Sarojini Naidu had first delivered the presidential address in the Kanpur session of the All India Congress. We used to read that address as a literary piece of great importance, and that of course inspired us to plunge into the political struggle also. That period of our life was, so to say, in the formative period, and we used to get inspiration from such like people. For example, in 1918, Annie Besant had delivered a similar address, and in 1925, when it came from Sarojini Naidu, certainly we were reading it, and then of course we thought that we must also plunge into this affair, and we should not remain on the banks, but we should plunge right into the struggle. Later on, of course, we found that there were occasions for us, and we had plunged into it, and Sarojini Naidu cast a great influence on the entire student community of that period.
So, Professor Chopra, you remember all that after 70 years.
Bhagat Singh was a class fellow of mine. We were living in the same room. He got so much inspiration that everybody knows now as to what part Bhagat Singh played in the political field or in the struggle for freedom. Similarly, there were many who got inspiration and they delved deep into the political arena. It is therefore these people, of course, these great scholars, especially Sarojini Naidu, she inspired us to a very great extent at that time. In 1932, I remember when we invited her to I was then a professor in Lahore, Sanathan College, and we invited her to address our students. She had gone there to Lahore in connection with some students' conference. Tagore also was there, and Sarojini Naidu was also there. They spoke from the one platform, and it was therefore that we invited both of them to our college, and both of them came and they spoke to our students also. Rabindranath, of course, spoke very calmly, quietly, and at the same time, and just like a great poet. But Sarojini Naidu was all fire, as if she is injecting some sort of very great, powerful incentive into the people at that time, into the young men. And they were very much impressed by both of them.
There was nothing narrow in Mrs. Naidu's outlook. She was a national leader, a leader of the Indian National Congress. But she, in the 40s, I had noticed, in the midst of the great turbulence and in the midst of the sharp divisions in national life between the Muslim League and the Congress, those who were participating in the 1942 movement and those who were not. In those days, even I remember that in 1944 December, Mrs. Naidu spoke to the workers of the Congress in these words. In times of great crisis, she said, humanity is greater than all political parties. In that spirit, Mrs. Naidu always went forward and spoke about the unity, the necessity for unity. And when relief work in Bengal famine was going apace, and women were being snatched away by those who wanted to trade in their flesh, she came out saying that how the light divine has emerged from the hidden springs of Bengal's womanhood. They have created a sisterhood of service. The quarrels between man and man, between community and community, are most unreal in the face of real distress. Again, she says, humanity is greater than community. I would also like to say a few words about Mrs. Naidu, not only as a national leader, but also her outlook as to women and their participation in national life. She was a member of the delegation which appeared before Minto and Morley for the franchise under the leadership of Mrs. Annie Besant. Later on, in 1927, when there was the All India Conference for Educational Reform at Pune, she said a very significant thing. She said, let it be remembered, it is not grown-up old women like me who are to usher in the new age. Nowadays, we have reached a time when the average woman is turning her attention to national work. These women, whether found in city or field, at the desk or the cradle, are the executives of the nation. Those were the days when there was a great debate as to whether the women's movement should be restricted to just social reform matters and work only through resolutions and memoranda. In about 1928, the All India Women's Conference was born. And amongst their leaders was also Mrs. Sarojini Naidu. I remember very well that in 1944, I think it was, that she came to the Bombay conference of the All India Women's Conference. And there she got a great ovation from all the delegates and all those who were gathered there. And most warm tributes were paid to her for her work for Hindu-Muslim unity. It was in this atmosphere that Mrs. Naidu was a great factor for cementing women of all different beliefs, faiths, and communities to weld themselves together for marching ahead for the emancipation of women and for the welfare of our nation.
She championed the cause of youth and energized the forces of the youth in the country. Could you tell us something about it?
Mrs. Naidu had a great liking for the youth of the country. I can speak from my personal experience. She came to Calcutta on a busy political schedule on 2 occasions when I personally approached her to address the gathering of the youth, once at the Calcutta University Institute. She had no time at her disposal. Still, she agreed to my request, and on her way to the Howrah station, she broke her journey and went to the Calcutta University Institute and spoke to the youth exhorting them to dedicate themselves for the cause of the motherland. On a different occasion, she came to our house at my invitation on a cultural mission, I should say, in this sense that she wanted to hear the songs of her brother Harindranath Chattopadhyay. Harinda was a great friend of ours, and he used to come to our house. And our friend Hemant Kumar Mukherjee started singing Harinda's famous song Surya Asta Ho Gya. And Mrs. Naidu attended that function of the youth and spent nearly 1 hour in spite of her busy political activities. This would go to show that she had a very soft corner for the young people of the country.
Whenever Mrs. Naidu used to come to Calcutta, she used to stay in our house in Wellington Square. That was the house of Dr. B.C. Roy, who not only was a national leader and colleague of Mrs. Naidu, but also her physician. I remember when we were children, whenever Mrs. Naidu used to come, the whole house used to become a center of activity, of joyousness, of laughter. She was really the epitome of a beautiful, joyous woman. I remember how she used to love putting on beautiful saris of rich colors, and she would come decked out in her long earrings, and always she used to tell my aunts and my mother, "Why do you put on white saris? There are such gorgeous, beautiful colors in the world." And she would flaunt her rich purple South Indian sari or her verdant green blouses and shawls. So really her personality was reflected in the colors and the flowers which she loved, in the jewelry which she loved to wear. That too was a part of her character, which was so joyous, humorous, and lively. Her laugh was infectious. Her laugh used to echo through our big rooms. Then I remember also how she was a really young person, even in that advanced stage in her life. Once I remember she was not at all well, and she was having a terrible cough. So my uncle decreed that she is not to see anybody. But the young students came, and when the Darwan came from downstairs carrying their slip, somehow it got to her hand. And without telling anybody, she asked the Darwan, "Bring up the young men." And there she was engrossed in conversation with them. So too, she was so full of zest of life. She loved eating rich food. Once my uncle had prescribed that she is to take nothing but the lightest of food. She told my mother, whispering, "Don't listen to Bidhan. You phone up my sister-in-law, Usha, and ask her to send her that beautiful mustard fish, which is a very great delicacy, but a rather rich dish in Bengal. So in every facet of her life, she was young, she was vibrant, she was joyous. That was the Mrs. Naidu which we saw as children in our house.
On the 13th of February 1949, her voice was stilled forever. But the joyous call of the Nightingale of India still beckons the later generations with an irresistible charm. As Pandit Nehru put it, she represented in herself a rich culture into which flowed various currents which have made Indian culture as great as it is.